Hello and welcome back to our podcast, What Now? On the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief, a podcast in partnership with Hospice Peterborough. My name is Julie Brown, and I'm joined today with my friends and colleagues.
David Kennedy.
And Red Keating.
Hi.
Good to see you all again.
Good to see you
It's
too.
been a while.
Has been a while. So today we wanted to talk about coming to terms with a new diagnosis. A really important topic for us to give some space to today, because of course so many of the people that we work with, have worked with, that we're going to deal with one day as people and the families we support with, this idea of what happens, what now, when we receive that news.
And that really is the shock of life, right? That happens, and that big news just and we're probably very rarely ready for that. And even although we might have suspicions, often those words just kind of come out and just nail us, right?
And you do see that from being a witness to people who have gone through receiving such news, that you're right, David, even when they might know it's coming or there's been some preparation, it still feels like a shock.
And I think that's where we got when you think about the title, what now? You get the shock, you get the news, and it's like, yeah, we all know it could come, but we all live as if it's not going to. Because I'm not sure how we would live if we were just constantly waiting for the shock to come. But and it really sort of has that. The shock also hits our sense of, I think, control. We think we're in control of our lives. We think that everything is going fine, and then we're given a diagnosis that just makes our world stop. Right? It just, and it sets us instantly into a different world. A new world. Now, all of a sudden, you've gone from being a person to being a patient. You've gone from being a person to being a diagnosis.
And that's your identity.
Yeah.
So often, I think that's the big piece, that we suddenly lose one identity and pick up another. What's interesting is that what what has been picked up in grief with Kubler-Ross's stages of grief was really her work in dying people. And it was never meant to be grief related, but she did identify those kinds of pieces around that diagnosis and that shock and denial, which is, I think, it's probably a true first reaction for most of us.
Yeah, and on that note with shock, something that I have observed is the shock lasts much longer than we think. Much, much longer. And I always find it interesting, like when you hear that news about someone, say, you care about, one of the first questions we'll ask, say it's a family member telling us, how are they doing? How is she doing? How is she coping? And they'll often say, much better than I thought. And what I have come to learn is, well, that's the shock, right? And so, yeah, they are dealing well, they are coping well in this moment, but the shock will be there, and so yes, the shock will be there in the first hours and days, but actually the shock is there much longer.
And it's a growing awareness. I think, we hear the words, we intellectually know those words, but we don't really embrace those words for ourselves at that moment. I think there's a period of time that's different for every one of us, and it's certainly different for the person who's been given that diagnosis and their family and caregivers. Everybody has to deal with that news. And I think the truth is that there's a need to have a growing sense of awareness before the full reality. And I don't know if that full reality sets in maybe until you've done all that you can do to kind of fix that and get cured. Maybe we don't really go there until all of those options have been gone through.
Well, it's interesting. You watch the shock. When I worked in the cancer clinic, and we knew someone was going to be given this news, and I would often wonder. I'd go in with the nurse and the doctor, and the person stopped hearing anything past whatever the diagnosis was. They'd hear the word cancer, you could see them glass over, and there'd be this explanation come from the doctor and all the things that were going to happen. And you just knew the person is sitting there and they're not hearing this bit. We always used to have someone come with them, but not all, that didn't always happen. And also someone to drive them home, because that initial shock, like Julie said, it's life changing. It's total. You can see it in their body, and they could not take in the information, but they were given a lot of information. So I think we can only take so much information, so much shock at a time. We need it to come in little bits. So I think that we start to deal with it like David. I think you're right. Like, so what now? Well, now you go home. That's what you do. And you get someone to drive you, hopefully, because you should probably not be having to have your mind do complex things like drive, because there's a lot of stuff now needing to settle into your psyche, into your identity. And the questions that you have about what you've just been told, we can answer again. But the whole information is given, and it's too much. But I understand why. But when you watch it happen in front of you, you see the person just close right down, because there's the defense mechanism that comes in. Because I can only take in so much shock. I can only take in so much news like that and make it make sense inside my head and inside my world.
It's true. Now, Julie, you've been very open and candid, and we really appreciate that, because I think it's helpful for all of us to come from some experience in all of this too. And you've had a diagnosis of a cancer diagnosis. Do you remember that when you were told the news, and what was that like for you?
Yeah, and I mean, for me, because my diagnosis came through being admitted to the emergency department because I was so ill. And so that word cancer started to come up in, it could be, we will see, we need to rule out that it's not cancer. And so the word started to be said. I had a different level of being shut down because I was in immense pain, like physical pain. And I was very, very ill. I had colon cancer, and I came into the emergency room with a blockage. So I was on morphine, I was I was vomiting, I was very ill. And so it all was very foggy for me. And then, I, over the next 48 hours was, in for an emergency colonoscopy, and then for emergency surgery. But I do remember the moment when the pathology report came back, and it was several days into my hospital stay, and my surgeon stopped by, and I remember that it was about 7 a.m, and nobody was there with me, and she told me the pathology reports had come back and confirmed cancer, which I knew that was coming, but as you said, it's something completely different to hear it. And I remember that she tried to offer me some kind of like good news. She was very, very kind. She said something about how, the good news is that the kind of chemo that you'll do for this cancer, you don't lose all your hair. I remember her saying that. And I remember thinking, well, I don't think I really care about my hair. I care about, will my children have a mother, a year from now, 6 months from now. And so, for me, it was like that word kept being put out there and kept being put out there. But I do remember her walking away. She stood in my doorway and walked away, and I felt stuck. I felt like a tsunami had hit me. I was already immobile because I was just post-surgery, and I was lying in my bed, and I was all alone, and I am sitting there with that news. And I call it the roar of trauma. I call it, just like that whoosh through my head, through my body of my nervous system. So activated, because this, what's happening, like in a very real sense, is, our bodies, our nervous systems are, identifying threat, and there is threat. So it's actually a perfectly normal response. Like, Red, when you say you would see people just kind of shut down and it was protective, it's like, that's exactly what's happening, right? nervous system goes on high alert, goes, oh, there's danger here, and if you can't run and you can't flee, then you're just going to shut down. And that is what I started to do. And then what's interesting is then you start to watch where other people in your life are in that journey, right? Because of course, our loved ones, our friends, our family, they're getting that news too. But we're all receiving that news at different times, and we're all able to absorb it to different levels of depth at the same time. So I look back on those days and I go, if you'd asked me if I was numb back then, I would have said I wasn't. But I have a distinct memory of remembering many, many, many weeks later where the full, I think quite a bit of the numbness wore off, and where I was feeling the full impact of that. But what I almost kind of feel like I just kind of stood back and now started to watch people circling around me and what they were doing. So it's happening to us, and it's also happening to the people around us.
Now, you mentioned that idea that the doctor's trying to give you some good news out of this. Do you think our minds go to the worst case scenario when we hear that word, those news, and that's kind of where we find ourselves being drawn?
It certainly was for me, and certainly when I've been forthright and asked the clients I worked with, that's certainly what they've told me too. I mean, we're talking about cancer in particular here. Let's face it, for so long, cancer was, a life-limiting illness, and of course it still is. But there's also great strides that have been made with cancer, and so I think we hear that word and we think cancer means death. Yeah,
It's very linked to our concept of mortality, right?
it is.
And so when that comes to visit you personally, mortality is right there with it. Right? And will my children have a mother? Is this going to take my life? What kind of uphill battle am I on? But the initial reaction was to shut down. But you said it took weeks for it to sink in.
So I was diagnosed. I went into hospital, I think it was on June 3rd. And I have a real distinct memory in the middle of August when we had a family vacation planned. And I insisted that my family still go on that vacation, and I was going to stay back, and I was going to do another round of chemo. And I really, really fell apart that week in a way that I have rarely, to the depths I rarely have in my life at any other point. And I think part of that was the protection, like my family weren't there, so I knew that I wasn't, didn't have to pretend to be okay because my kids weren't going to, show up any moment. But I also really believe that some of that was just, I was like 2.5 months into it at that point. And I'd had a couple rounds of chemo at that point while my family was away, and I stayed back so I could do this round of chemo. I was then told I couldn't continue with chemo because all my blood counts were off. And so I was really physically unwell. And I think the combination of being so physically unwell also and not having to pretend to be okay really bottomed out.
I think it puts us into many different worlds. I think, for most of us, and Julie, you had background in medical pieces, so maybe that was helpful, maybe it's not. But I think of people who hear those words and get that diagnosis. In that moment, as you said, Red, everything changes. And there's this sense of, I don't know what to do in this world. I don't know what I should be doing. And I don't know what my options are. I don't know what even I want to do. And then, you get all the other pieces of family that are also have an agenda about what you ought to do. And it's a pretty terrifying time.
Well, and on top of that, David, what we have going on there is we're so taught that if there's a problem, go find the solution. Don't just sit there, go do something. And all of a sudden there's nothing you can do. And I know for me, I was on a very restrictive diet after surgery for many, many weeks, basically eating all the things you would think, like white flour and like no high fiber food and vegetables and that were high in fiber. And so I remember having this, like going back to what you said about control, Red, it felt so hard, this idea of like, so the only thing I feel like I can control right now is maybe like if I feed myself well, and like, but I can't actually really feed myself well. Like they don't even want me to be eating whole wheat toast right now. I should just be eating white toast. And I remember just feeling like the loss of control of even my own agency, to feel like I was doing, or I'm doing that in air quotes, or like fixing something, thinking like, okay, well, maybe I can make a difference, by what I eat. And thankfully I had this really blunt home care nurse who one day said to me, because I was lamenting about how I really did like the scones people were bringing. And I said, but like there's a lot of sugar in their white flour. And she said, well, I don't want to be mean, but like, you already have cancer, right? Like it's already happened. So like, eat the scone, drink your tea if that's what's bringing you some pleasure in the morning. I mean, just simple wisdom, but it was kind of orienting for me. But just that feeling of helplessness, of like, I should be able to do something to fix it, which is why I really understand why people start thinking I need to drink that magical elixir or that magical smoothie or the superfoods or the this or that. It's, so much of that is trying to get control in a world where we've lost profoundly our sense of control and agency.
And I think I don't know if that can be expressed or stretched enough, in that control, it comes to visit and it takes over. It's that visitor that you just want to leave, like they're just obnoxious in your household. It takes all of your time. It takes all of your attention. It's one doctor's appointment after another. It's blood work. It's chemo. It's a doctor's appointment. It's x-rays. It's feeling the effects of chemo if you're having symptoms and an effect from chemo that just take all, it just is all encompassing. Mm-hmm. It takes all your energy and all your focus. And so control, anything that you can control, becomes incredibly important, because you realize that you're in control of so little. And it becomes, I think you said it, an identity. It's almost like, oh my God, my identity has gone from being, freestanding person to cancer patient. People at the hospital know my name, because I'm there enough. Mm-hmm. Which is very different. And that's that. Anything that you can grasp at, that gives you a sense that you have some agency in your life, and you have some control over some of the decisions that happen to you. Right?
I remember a really simple example of that for me was I had chemo on Wednesdays, and in the early rounds, I did 12 rounds of chemo. In the early rounds of chemo, typically by Monday, sometimes I would start to feel it emptying from my body, and I'd start to kind of feel my brain kind of come back online. And my daughter had dance on Monday nights, and we had this wonderful supportive community, and somebody would offer always to go drive her to dance and drive her home. And it was really important to me to drive her to dance when I felt well enough, even though there were people lining up at the door wanting to do that for us. But that was this sense of normal, and that's in control. Like, I am still her mother. Part of my role as her mother is I drive her to dance. And I can remember on my way home from dropping her off, I'd listen to CBC and I'd say, well, this is a normal moment. And I'd actually say that to myself, okay, this is a few minutes of normal. And that is the way I started to think about time. This is an okay moment. That moment was really hard, but this moment is okay. And I started to have to really kind of break the moments down through the day.
Struck me what you said earlier there, Julie, about the nurse and your scone and your tea. How did
never underestimate the power of a good scone.
Yeah. But it's interesting that we often need permission to be able to do those things. And that so there's the two things that kind of play there. One, that grasp of needing to have some control of normalcy, like taking my daughter to dance, but at the same time not knowing everything and being open, and somebody needing to give you permission to do something that's okay. And again, it speaks to me of the value of having good people around you, because the other side of it is that you're getting all the other negative kind of advice and discussion, and people who don't want to deal with that, and oh, you're fine, and you'll be okay, and who
Yeah.
want to avoid any of the realities of this. So it's kind of a fine line, isn't it, of the realities of what this disease is, and yet not losing hope or optimism, um, but being in that world, and it must be like a roller coaster, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think let's go there. I think that's a really important. Let's talk about that. About there's the person, and then there's the people around the person.
Well, it's funny because you said advice, and my head was on advice as you were talking. In that sense, you hear someone has a new diagnosis. Well, everybody has an opinion about that, or they know somebody. I know somebody with that who had that, and it's like, well, they might have had that cancer, but they're a different person. Well, they didn't have to have radiation. It's like, well, this person does. Well, why is that? And all these questions that can be directed, around to friends and family, but to the person as well, who is the person who's living with cancer. In that sense that everyone can then throw in their 2 cents worth into the pot. And I think it was really important for folks that are hearing all that to kind of go, I need to hear what my doctor has to say, because it's different. It might be colon cancer, or it might be a different type of skin cancer, let's say. But the treatment process for this particular cancer for you could be very different.
That's right.
Than for someone else. But everybody wants to throw in their 2 cents worth. I don't know if they're trying to be supportive, or if they're just trying to have a conversation about it, because it's easier to have a conversation with somebody that isn't so focused on the person that they know.
Well, it's an uncomfortable place to sit with somebody in it without trying to fix it or give them advice.
That's right.
And I think the other piece that gets thrown around here a lot that I've witnessed is that people very quickly turn to the internet and start to do the magical searching around that magical cure. And we all know that there are some bizarre things out there
Yes.
that are offered as cure. I mean, we could have some fun talking about what we've all experienced, but it is just crazy. But there's that sense where people want to find out. Maybe I can find out.
But I think that also has an essence of control to it as well, because people want to be helpful. People want to give the advice to help the person to feel like that they've got some control, because like it's really uncomfortable to sit there and know that there's not a whole lot you can do other than maybe bake a scone, which doesn't seem like all that big a thing in the face of a cancer diagnosis. But boy, it might be one of the best things someone could do.
Yeah, so I'm just, I'm sitting here thinking, so for those who may be listening to this, who are supporting someone who's coming to terms with a diagnosis, part of your role is to bear witness to their experience, wherever that may take them. And to, to notice that urge that may arise in you to, where's the solution? How do we fix it? Where's the magic elixir? Because some of that is just, that's your care, but that's also your own distress. And so part of your work then becomes getting support for yourself outside of maybe that circle to help you manage that distress, so that you can really show up in a way that really allows you to be present and really hold space for that person, but where your own distress, which can quickly become an agenda to find that magic elixir, or let's get you doing this or that, can kind of get in the way of that.
Can you speak to, Julie, maybe the statement, if you need anything, give me a call?
Yeah, I sure can.
Okay, because that gets said a lot.
Yes.
If you need anything,
give me a
just
call.
give me a call.
So when you're coming to terms, when you just received the diagnosis, and the whole way through, the whole way through. You don't know what you need. You don't know what you need. And especially in those early weeks, you really don't know what you need. You're overwhelmed. Um, we were lucky that we had some people doing things that we didn't even know they were doing, because they were seeing things that needed to be done. I think the best thing that we can do is if you really want to do something, so rather than saying, let me know, they're never going to let you know. I don't think I really ever let anybody know. But I really appreciate it when people would say, we'd like to send dinner next week. Does Tuesday or Wednesday work? You don't need to let us know right now, but I'll check in with you next week. Right? Because that was one of the other things. Even arranging that in my head felt like too much. And so sometimes I'd say, oh, can you talk to so-and-so? They're going to arrange all of that. Right? So be specific, say like, I noticed that it's that time of year for the flower beds to be cut back. I'd like to swing by on the weekend and do that. Would that be helpful for you? Or, I know your kids, have that hockey tournament coming up. I'd like to help that weekend. Please count me in for, Saturday morning if they have a practice or a game. So be really specific because the person just can't really think about it. And if you can't be really specific, then say that. To say, I so badly want to be helpful to you. I'm not sure how I can, but just know that I'm really holding you in my thoughts right now. I really care, and I'm just going to keep checking in. And yeah.
So if we talk about a support system, so that initial diagnosis, and I think things change and develop as that treatment goes on, and the diagnosis works its way out into what this is going to look like over the next little while. But what are the important pieces of a support system around us that really helps us find our way in all of this? Who do we need? What kinds of support are we in need of?
So one of the first things that come to mind is when there's a brand new diagnosis and the shock is rippling through your kind of your community of people, there's this need people have to see you, right? So people end up at the hospital who don't need to be there. Or they're coming by the house in a few days and in the first week, and that can be fine if the person enjoys that. But what they don't need is to be entertaining company, right? What they don't need is a bunch of gift bags that they have to kind of break up and figure out what to do and gift like that. That is not what they do need. Are people who can really be present, who can really read the cues and can figure out what needs to be done. So maybe while I come over to visit you and we're having tea, I'm going to just check your washer and dryer and just see if there's some clothes that I can fold while I'm here. So I just need to put my plug in for that. In those initial days, I know that your community really feels like I need to see you, and that can be helpful. But as the patient, you're not up for entertaining people. So if you're going to go visit the person, make sure that you are kind of ready to maybe carry the conversation or to make yourself helpful in some way.
I think that's a real important one that I heard you say there is separating what I may need and the needs of the person. And this is not about my needs as a family member, caregiver, whatever. And I hear that so often where people will say, well, I just need to see them. And the reality is that you may need that, but what is it that they need? Mm-hmm. So, and sometimes we talk about having, gatekeepers and people who can kind of keep that piece in check so that it's not up to the person who's dealing with the diagnosis to have to do all those interpersonal things, but somebody who can kind of be a good gatekeeper for them.
Yeah, and you could have different gatekeepers. You could have a gatekeeper around who's dropping meals off, right? You could have someone who's organizing who's going to come visit, or right? Those can be different people.
Back in the day, we used to talk to folks in the hospital, and I would say, if you're not up for company, if you're not up for people dropping it's okay for you to write a note and put it on your door and say, just not feeling up for visiting today. Thanks for dropping by. And just leave that on the door. And if someone knocks through it, just don't answer. Because if you don't put yourself, you have to put yourself first. And there's some things you can control. We talk about changing your voice message on your phone for your answering machine. Just to say, I'm doing well. I probably will not respond to this message, but thank you for your call. And just let everything go to the voicemail. So that you can put in those protective things. If you've got people, all the better. If you've got those gatekeepers, that's great. But if there's times when you're feeling like you don't, because back to the control thing, there are some things you can control, and you can feel the whim of other people's needs, right? My need to be there to show you how much I care when you are feeling like you can hardly lift your head off a pillow. This might not be the day for that, and so there are little things that we can do to help control the environment when we feel so out of control, and help with the gatekeeping, right? So that we're not putting undue pressure on ourselves to perform for other people.
I do want to say, something that I learned in this very deep, profound way is how hard it is for us humans to ask for what we need. It is profoundly vulnerable to say, here is what I need, because when we make our needs really explicit, we of course don't know if they're going to be met, or how they'll be met, or by whom. And it feels very vulnerable at a time when we're already so vulnerable. And yet I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt, it is how I got through it, is by being pretty specific with some very specific people about what I needed from them. And the thing with that, the inner narrative that I started to bump up against was I felt needy. And that word has so many negative connotations in our society that, in a society that so values, this individualism, autonomy and independence. And I, all of a sudden, so I didn't want company, but I did want safe people around me, because when I felt so emotionally, mentally, and physically unwell, I actually didn't want to lie there by myself all day. And it felt really hard to say to people, I actually don't want to be alone. Like, please don't leave me alone. Like, can we make up a schedule so that there are people here? And they're not going to be company for me, but it is going to be a presence in the house. Like when my family wasn't home. That felt like a very, very hard thing to do, but really necessary for my own mental health. And I just want to say that having had that experience myself, it's something that I've spoken with many, many clients, and almost without exception, people have told me, oh yeah, no, I don't want to be alone. But that is not what they're telling their family. They don't want company. They don't want to entertain people. But even when they're napping, it can feel nice to know that somebody else is just reading in the living room, right? Or maybe is working from home. And so, and that's really human. That's really human. That's a really basic need, to want to feel connected to people when we're most, when we're most vulnerable, when we're scared, when we're unwell, that we don't want to be left alone. And it's a very hard thing for us to express.
I think we could, sorry.
I just gonna say, but not necessarily to visit, but to be in the space. Yeah. And like fishing, like people sit in the boat all day, cast, the line into the water. They don't talk, but they're together. There's a communication happening anyway. But when I'm hearing you say that story, Julie, it wasn't to be in the house, to visit, to entertain. It was to be a presence.
That's right.
Right. So
I needed to not.
It didn't
feel
require
alone.
conversation. It
That's
didn't
right.
require to fill the space with noise.
Mm-hmm.
What it required was to put another presence in the space.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what I'm feeling right now is we've just touched the tip of the iceberg.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, the initial diagnosis and then what is a long process.
Mm-hmm.
And I think our needs change, even our supports change along the way. So,
that's
I-
that's something we could talk
I
about
think
for
we
a whole
could have
episode
another
around
episode.
how our relationships change
Yeah.
with ourselves, with
Right.
our families, with our friends. Yeah.
So, but for this one, the that shock and that, I think it's important that people realize they're not crazy and that it does take time, and that's unique for each one of us, and that the gift of having the right people around us is such an important gift. And if you're one of the people that are supporting others, then to recognize that, that need to, as we've just talked, to be present without feeling like we have to fill a void or fix it and make it all better. What a gift that is. But that takes some work within us. So this diagnosis is life-changing for so many people in our.
That's right.
But I think it's important for us to have had this conversation for sure. Thanks.
Thank you.
Ah.